On a quiet airfield in New Zealand, a small band of engineers are revolutionising our understanding of First World War aircraft. For 5 years, this project has been putting modern-day pilots into the cockpit of these ancient warplanes, experiencing what life would have been like flying above the Western Front. Now, for the first time, television cameras have been allowed into their top-secret workshops, where World War I fighters are being built to the finest detail. From original designs.
I'd see the drawing and be like, oh, cool, it's a plane, that's quite interesting. And there'd be somebody's name, and it would have a date, 1915, 1914. And that sort of really hit home. I was like, wow, that's pretty cool.
With no World War I flyers still alive, this work is the one link we have to the designs that changed the history of Europe and meant the difference between life and death for thousands of young men.
We focus on creating stuff that doesn't exist. We have the ability to compare those airplanes by using the real thing, essentially. That's the only way you can get that sight, the sound, the smell of these airplanes.
Between 1914 and 1980, a small band of geniuses turned the aeroplane from eccentric novelty to decisive weapon. They invented modern warfare. This is the story of how they did it.
The fact that we can get these airplanes in the air is phenomenal. We can go back in time.
August 1914. The armies of Germany range against Britain and France. Hundreds of thousands of men, hell-bent on destruction. But many were convinced that the war will be won not by brute strength, but by a new technology barely 10 years old.
Every major power was preparing for war, and part of that meant looking at this new idea, this new concept of what were they going to do with aeroplanes.
At the outbreak of war, powered flight was still a lethally dangerous pastime. Planes so flimsy that a gust of wind, barely strong enough to lift a piece of paper, could flip them over.
They were often referred to as kites, and they handled like kites. They were blown around by the wind. Even we have difficulty with some of these airplanes. They have unusual handling characteristics affected by wind. The performance is terrible compared to some modern airplanes.
And many top brass wanted nothing to do with these new flying machines. Some even refer to them as useless contraptions.
The people at the top were certainly not convinced. They'd seen evidence that the aircraft could perform jobs for them, but it's very difficult for something that is in few numbers, unreliable, somewhat dangerous, to really be able to prove what direction it could take itself and take the army.
War had been waged without planes before, and war would be waged without planes now.
I mean, one of the most sceptical of the generals was undoubtedly Sir John French, who just couldn't think of why they were necessary. He didn't see the point. They were too frail, too inconsequential in the scheme of things.
But there were some who were determined to prove their worth. Exactly 100 years ago, in 1912, the Royal Flying Corps were formed. This small group of men were convinced that military superiority lay in the sky. And they wouldn't need to wait long to put their ideas to the test. The early days of the First World War were a time of movement, of armies advancing through open fields and towns. Commanders could see no further than the hill or hedgerow in front of them. In the first throes, cavalry reconnaissance was used to see what the enemy were doing. But modern firepower made this a suicidal operation. operation. Barely a week into the fighting, the so-called overrated contraptions entered the fray.
It's amazing to think that it's the first time people have ever flown. It seems unbelievable that in just a few short years they're actually going to war.
While the Germans worked on a plane of their own, the British invested in the BE-2. Designed 2 years before the war had even been declared, the plane was the work of legendary designer Geoffrey de Havilland. In New Zealand, Gene and his colleagues have built an exact replica of his Trailblazer. Perfect down to the last detail, it gives Gene the same experience as a pilot in 1914.
Here we are at home in a BE-2C.
The plane flew with the pilot in the rear, an observer up front.
Every airplane sort of has its own personality. You get a real taste for what it's like to fly these old airplanes.
It was unarmed, and its maximum speed was only 72 miles per hour. In a strong headwind, it would be static, literally floating.
These early BE-2Cs were strictly used for observation in the beginning of the war. They weren't armed in any way, they weren't armored in any way, and they were slow, fragile airplanes that could, barely get aloft with 2 people on board.
De Havilland designed the plane purely for spying on the enemy below.
In the early days, it was really just the pilot, the observer, and their trusty notebook and their pen. And they'd go up and they'd have a map strapped to one knee and they'd have a notebook on the other.
With no radios, getting their intelligence back to base was a primitive operation.
And they'd draw a diagram on their knee with notes of what they could see and then fly over the nearest army headquarters and just drop a message back. And that was all it was. That's all there could be in the first couple of months of the war.
These basic sketches were the result of the most advanced spying equipment in the history of warfare. For the first time, the army had an eye in the sky, and it soon became obvious what this could do to an active battlefield. Artillery, the most deadly weapon of any army, suddenly got a whole lot more accurate. All because of this new machine.
These aircraft really came into their own in cooperating with the artillery. They were able to be, in effect, missile guidance systems.
The aircraft could be used to guide the artillery to hit an exact target.
As the war went on, the role of the Royal Flying Corps sort of slightly mutates. They become less the eyes of the whole army, and very much more they become the eyes of the artillery.
But with no GPS or laser guidance, the problem was how to exactly communicate the whereabouts of a target in a vast landscape. Planes were re-engineered to carry a Morse code radio. The airman would see where a shell lands and communicate directly back to the artillery. The guns are then adjusted accordingly. This continued until the target was destroyed.
And then when you actually hit your target, you send a signal, say, go ahead. At which point the whole battery will open fire to destroy. And that's when the mayhem starts.
A few months after the start of the war, both sides were dug in. It was stalemate. Trenches and earthworks stretched from Switzerland to the North Sea. This deadlock also meant change for the Royal Flying Corps. They would need faster, more agile planes. Because these new defences were manned by thousands of troops, all well armed and all looking up to the skies. France, 1915. The slaughter of the Western Front was well underway, and hundreds of thousands of men were dug in. The Royal Flying Corps were being pushed for any breakthrough, that might unlock the stalemate of the trenches. Drawing sketches of these complex battlefields is no longer good enough.
The thing about sketches is they're great in a war of movement, when you're just, putting a big arrow on a map showing which way things are going. It's very different when trenches are established. And then you really want to know exactly where the trenches are.
Trench warfare meant that for the first time the battlefield was static. It was gridlock. Machine gun nests were dug in and fortified. Permanent communication lines were built, and barbed wire strung out in front of the trenches. It had become critical to accurately map the battlefield, to know every hidden danger. The answer lay in another relatively new technology: photography.
If you take a camera up and take a photograph, then you can come back, bring it back, develop it, and then it can be taken to headquarters and you can collectively examine it and determine exactly what's on the ground. You can see where the machine guns are. You can see where the German artillery batteries are. You can see where the communication trenches are, where the dugouts are, where the headquarters are.
For the Royal Flying Corps, this meant spending more time over enemy trenches, getting more accurate images. A dangerous job got a whole lot riskier. The first casualties come only 3 weeks after war was declared. Pilot Vincent Waterfall and his observer, Charles Bailey, were shot down while spying on German troop movements in Belgium. Aviators had become the #1 target. They had to be prevented from getting home with their information.
The level of anti-aircraft fire was such that you would expect to pretty much have it on every single mission. Completely surrounded by bursting brown and white clouds of smoke filled with red-hot bits of iron.
The canvas and timber planes offered no protection.
These young guys had to be really brave. They're protected by essentially a wicker seat and fabric. You could poke a sharp stick through the side of these airplanes. They weren't exactly armored.
The BE-2, the standard British observation plane, was not designed to carry unwieldy cameras. Gary and Bevan are about to experience this firsthand.
This is gonna be interesting.
They want to see just how easy it would have been for a First World War aviator to get usable photographs.
Obviously, in this airplane, it's quite obstructed. I've got wires, I've got the landing gear in the way. Of course, lower wing is in the way. Not ideal.
It's 900! Can't be high enough!
Bevan tries to brace the camera steady, but in the 70-mile-per-hour slipstream, the photos are blurred, and without a decent overlap, the individual photos are useless. In 1914, the pressure fell on the engineers to come up with a solution. Gene's team had to make the same changes.
These cameras were often fitted right to the side of the airplane with a mounting bracket that allowed it to be mounted straight down right here. Quite convenient because the wing is actually cut out to allow the pilot to look straight down.
But that wasn't enough. Every last bit of speed and maneuverability needed to be squeezed out. The planes needed an overhaul. The timber landing gear is thrown away to save weight. The upper wing is lengthened to increase lift. And flattened steel wires replace the older drag-prone woven cables.
The combination of all these small advances, like the use of streamlined wires, that's what led to huge steps forward in aircraft technology. And those were the kind of things that really advanced the aircraft in the war.
These changes brought an immediate success for the airmen. But there was one thing that needed to be solved by the pilots themselves. It was critical to link the features in a landscape, to understand where one trench system was in comparison to another. That meant flying slowly and in a straight line, taking perfect, interlinking photographs.
If you were flying in the straight line that you had to fly to take a series of photographs, then a German anti-aircraft gun was a real danger. They could tell exactly where you'd be, they could shoot ahead of you, and they could get very close to you.
The most basic attempt to take photos in mid-air is giving Gary and Bevan an appreciation of what a First World War pilot would have gone through.
Imagine doing that though and getting shot at the same time.
It's pretty much a almost guaranteed suicide mission, half of
It would definitely be risky, that's for sure.
But while the flyers were fair game for the troops on the ground, pilots on opposing sides were often friends. Before the war, many knew each other from air shows. Some went as far as observing a gentleman's code. Firing at another airman was strictly off limits. But the code couldn't last. It wasn't long before planes became targets not just for the ground soldiers, but also for enemy airmen.
They have almost no choice of weaponry. They take up the weapons they have to hand. And to hand, the most obvious is the revolver. Now, the average British officer cannot hit a barn door on the ground at 20 yards. Because they jerk about so much. But the British Army does have an accurate weapon. It has the Lee Enfield, the rifle. It's brilliant, it's accurate. But the problem is when you're in that open cockpit again.
Gene's team plan to find out just how easy or hard it is to hit a target from these unstable platforms.
And we're going to use these laser rifles, so it's not nearly as dangerous as it was in the First World War. You know how valuable the airplanes are. We don't want to take any chances.
The laser rifles are loaded with 5 shots per magazine, the same as with the Lee Enfield rifle. Each shooter is strapped with sensors, so they'll know if they've been shot. Barely over 18, Bevan and Josh are the same age as many of the young pilots in the Great War. But unlike their counterparts, they're in the safe hands of veteran pilots John and Gene, who have thousands of flying hours experience. In World War I, some pilots were sent up after only 6 hours of training. Now at altitude, the aircraft separate and position themselves for the fight. The planes will joust with 3 passes, and any direct hits will be registered on the sensors. Right from the start, engine oil already coats the camera lens. It's also getting into Bevan's goggles. The planes pass each other at a nerve-wracking short distance, with a closing speed of 120 miles per hour. With the propeller, struts and wires in the way, the gunners still find it awkward to take aim.
I guess we're still alive!
That's really hard. The oil and stuff on your goggles, you can't see anything.
Then you got the prop arc and you got the streamlined wires and the struts. It's near impossible.
I mean, we fly these airplanes a lot and do displays and stuff, but when you're actually setting out to, accomplish a specific task like this, you don't realize how difficult it is.
30 shots were fired between the 2 observers, and not one hit the target.
Whose idea was it to wear this during the war?
100 years ago, the results were very often the same. Their experiences can only be told by those no longer with us.
The arms issued to the Royal Flying Corps personnel at that time was a rifle. If you saw an enemy aircraft, then you took this rifle out, you would let them have it, best you could. You had to be very careful not to shoot any of your controls away.
We met a German at about the same altitude as ourselves. I put up my sights and fired 6 deliberate shots. It was miserable that I didn't apparently hit him at all. I've no doubt I was miles away. We later on learnt with the vibrating platform that effective range was rarely exceeded 50 yards.
It became obvious that there was only one weapon that could be effective at hitting a plane in mid-air. The same weapon used for slaughtering thousands of infantrymen on the Western Front. The machine gun. The machine gun had turned warfare into industrialized killing. A single Vickers or Lewis gun could fire nearly 500 rounds a minute. Keeping control of these weapons in mid-air created a fresh problem for the engineers. How to attach these heavy, violently aggressive weapons to a fragile airplane.
I think after looking at the BE-2s, the early progression, that BE-2C that we have without any guns mounted on it at all. And then the next step was that BE-2F, where they mounted a few Lewis guns on those candlestick mounts where you could actually fire the gun around. But you had to be careful that you weren't shooting your own airplane. You had a very narrow arc where you could fire forward or maybe to the back. That was very limiting for defending yourself.
It soon became clear that the best way to use a machine gun in mid-air was to turn the whole plane into a weapon.
Having a fixed gun and just aiming the airplane was determined the best way to go. If the pilot could actually point the airplane at the enemy and chase him and actually pull a trigger and shoot, that was ideal.
But that would mean the gun would have to be placed on the fuselage, firing straight through the propellers.
The problem with trying to fire through the arc of the propeller is that the bullets are coming out of the machine gun at a particular rate. The propeller, which is made of wood, is flying around, passing the line of fire at a different rate. And anyone who's done a little bit of physics about these things will know that there's a point at which the bullet is going to hit the propeller.
It had become the key engineering challenge: how to mount a machine gun on a plane without shooting up the propeller. For de Havilland and the Royal Flying Corps, it had become the priority. But on the other side of the trenches, the Germans were also looking for a solution. One of the groups was headed by a man only 24 years of age, a man whose name would become synonymous with First World War aviation: Anthony Fokker. The former stunt flyer's designs would provide the German Air Force with more than 700 planes in the course of the war. But it could have been so different. Fokker was from Holland, a neutral country. Before the war, he had offered his services to the British Army. But the British had turned him down.
Later on, when you look at what he achieved for the Germans, then there is a slight feeling of if only he'd been working for us, because he clearly was very good at putting together an expert team of designers, and he got the job done.
What Fokker would deliver would turn the tide of the war and result in the death of thousands of Allies. (1915). 1 year into the war, aircraft and the intelligence they carried were proving critical to the war effort. The enemy wanted them dead. But shooting down a plane relied as much on luck as on judgment. The hope was to find a way of strapping a forward-facing machine gun to a plane's fuselage. The problem was that despite the relentless testing, no one had yet found a way of shooting around the plane's propellers. Whoever did so would rule the skies. The first breakthrough would come thanks to a Frenchman. Roland Garros had raced planes before the war and gained fame for flying across the Mediterranean from southern France to Tunisia.
Roland Garros, one of the first guys to do such a thing, mounted a fixed gun and firing through the propeller of his tractor airplane, the engine in the front, mounted little wedge-shaped metal blocks to the back of the propeller just to deflect those bullets.
It's undeniable that Garros was a brave man. When you think that what would happen with a bullet hitting one of these deflector blades, it is a very brave man who'll sit 1 metre, 2 metres behind these deflector blades. The clue's in the word, the bullet's going to be deflected back into you.
He used his reinforced propeller to make 3 kills before engine failure forced him to crash land behind enemy lines.
Well, when Garros was shot down, he tried to set fire to his airplane, and he managed it, but he didn't destroy all of it. The Germans could see what he'd been up to.
20 minutes after his capture, he was photographed by the Germans, and his system handed to a young Dutch aviation designer, Anthony Fokker.
And they looked seriously at Garros's method. However, they had slightly more common sense, perhaps, than Garros, and they resolved to go the route of an interrupter mechanism.
Fokker's interrupter mechanism synchronized the gun's firing rate so that bullets flew between the gaps of the spinning propeller blade. Fokker fitted the mechanism to his own aircraft design, the Eindecker. The Eindecker itself was not an impressive flying machine. Its maximum speed was only 87 miles per hour, and it could stay up for just an hour and a half.
They weren't great by any means as far as their flying capability, but they had this one technological advancement, which was the interrupter gear, which allowed them to score numerous victories. They became a deadly tool to shoot down the enemy.
It would dive down, out of the clouds, out of the sun, onto an unsuspecting British plane, and then it would fire through its propeller, take them by surprise, and shoot them down before they knew what was happening.
It marked a new chapter in aerial warfare. The first purebred fighter aircraft had been born. In the few months after Fokker's new plane was introduced, 82 Allied planes were shot down. 74 lives had been lost. It was a time that became known as the Fokker Scourge.
As ever with these things, the press and politicians had a field day. This was the Fokker Scourge. This was why hadn't we foreseen this? Why weren't we doing something about it? Why wasn't it sorted out now? Well, the answer is because it takes between 1 and 2 years to design an aircraft. You can't just magic them up.
The Eindecker destroyed Britain's ability to spy freely over the trenches. Tens of thousands of Allied lives relied on this aerial intelligence.
For the soldier in the trenches, the Royal Flying Corps was a godsend, a literal godsend, because without them, then the German artillery, the German machine guns, would slaughter them when they went over the top. It was as simple as that.
The commanders knew that if they didn't come up with a solution, they would lose the air war. But no one had an answer to Fokker's interrupter mechanism. The Allies were forced to fall back on old pre-war designs.
Just looking at this airplane, it's quite a bit different, but the most notable difference is the engine being mounted in the back.
This strange design became known as the pusher. The engine literally pushed the plane through the air. Though it looked unconventional, the front end was freed up for unimpeded machine gun fire.
The 2 machine guns are mounted in the front of the nacelle, and they could fire unobstructed directly ahead. So they didn't have to worry about shooting through a propeller, they didn't have to worry about an interrupter gear.
This FE2 was the only one of its kind flying today, giving the team in New Zealand a unique perspective.
The guys up front have to make sure that they don't have anything loose on their bodies, clothing, helmet, goggles that could fly back and hit the propeller. The shell casings that were discharged from the gun were in danger of going through the propeller and damaging it. So they had to come up with another solution, and that was bags such as these to collect the spent cartridges.
In January 1916, 6 months after the start of the Fokker Scourge, the Pusher was introduced to the Western Front. The impact was almost immediate. The air war began to swing the Allies' way. The Pusher arrived just in time for a new British offensive. The land troops had started massing for a huge new strike by the Somme River in France. The land offensive would be a disaster. But it could have been so much worse had the Allied Pusher not dominated the skies.
During the first 2 or 3 months of the Somme, the British had control over the battlefield, which allowed them complete freedom of photographic reconnaissance and artillery observation. This was extraordinarily bad for the Germans, who suffered a great deal more than they otherwise would have done. So this is an important thing. Control of the air does matter, and it affects the men on the ground.
And air support became even more crucial during the second stage of the Somme battle. Aircraft observers had noticed a new, elaborate German trench system in the exact section the British were planning to attack. Thanks to this intelligence, the push was redirected and thousands were saved. But the Germans had been working on a new secret weapon. An airplane design that was about to draw the Allied airmen into their own version of the Somme.
They say the designer watched fish swimming in a fishbowl to come up with that streamlined fuselage.
Designed from scratch and reaching the front 2 months later, the Albatros was the most advanced aircraft ever built. By building an exact replica, Gene and his team have discovered the lengths the Germans went to achieve even the smallest performance improvement, even down to details such as the levels of dope or sealant the Germans used.
Things like this are discovered by building the airplane itself. I mean, we found out the weight savings were significant. It's that experience that we love discovering. Certain technological advances that you wouldn't know otherwise unless you actually built one of these airplanes.
The key element was the fact that it had 2 machine guns. It had twice the firepower of anything else in the sky.
This firepower was used to usher in a new kind of aerial warfare. The Germans formed the first fighter squadrons. Albatrosses began to hunt in packs. Engine technology was also advancing. Both sides developed planes powerful enough to carry a heavy payload of bombs. It was only a dozen years since the first powered flight, and now all the traits of modern aerial warfare were in place. In 1917, the Allies turned their attention to a new spring offensive, close to the French village of Arras. But the battle would start with the Germans in control of the skies. The British Pusher was no match for the Albatros. Without intelligence from above, the British troops on the ground risked another massacre. The British Army's solution was to swamp the front with a huge number of planes. 25 squadrons, 365 aircraft in total. The Germans had merely 10 squadrons, but they had the Albatros.
So what they do is they carry on flying their missions. They carry on doing everything the artillery and the army want them to, and they suffer the casualties as they come. It's murderous. They go up, if they encounter the enemy, they're going to be shot down. Many of them knew that they were up there for other people. They fully understood their role. They knew they were dying for their country, and they carried on doing it. It's a particular form of sacrifice that I find quite inspirational.
In supporting the troops below, the British lose 2/3 of their aircraft. The Royal Flying Corps gives the destruction a name of its own: Bloody April. But despite the casualties, the Royal Flying Corps did get some intelligence through. When the Allied troops went over the top, there was hardly any opposition. Aerial reconnaissance had ensured that the German guns were annihilated. The Royal Flying Corps' intelligence had worked. Although their losses had been horrendous, no one now doubted the importance of plane power.
The Royal Flying Corps is right at the centre of army plans. They have to do their job. If they don't, people on the ground will suffer, they'll die. It's crucial.
But the Germans still had the superior machinery. The pressure fell on the Royal Aircraft Factory to come up with an improved fighter that would be a match for the deadly Albatros. In 1917, the war had raged for 3 years. In the skies above France, the Allies were still struggling to design a fighter to match the Germans' Albatros. 2 British designers based in Farnborough, John Kenworthy and Henry Folland, were working on a breakthrough fighter. Called the SE-5, they hoped it would be fast, muscular, and armed with a brand new interrupter gun mechanism. But its development was not going to plan. In January 1917, the Royal Flying Corps' chief test pilot, Major Gooden, was killed while flying it. Pilots' feedback suggested the seating position was too high, the windscreen was too tall, and they thought it was underpowered. The pressure on Kenworthy and Folland was ratcheting up.
I think everyone in the aviation industry back at home realised the importance of what they were doing. They're on an escalator they can't get off. And if you make a mistake, you can have an aircraft that is completely useless. It's a difficult business, and everybody's very aware that if they make mistakes, then people will suffer.
The new version of the SE-5 was finally delivered to the front in June 1917. And it was transformed.
You get into the SE-5, and in all honesty, if you didn't know what airplane you were getting into, you'd swear that that airplane was a 30s or even a 40s design and was really a fighter to be reckoned with.
It had exceeded all expectations. British engineers had built the fastest plane of the war, but the ultimate test would be in battle. The British SE-5 and the German Albatros would become one of the ultimate duels of the First World War. In New Zealand, Gene DeMarco and his colleagues have built an exact replica SE-5.
These airplanes were loved by the pilots who flew them. They were easy to fly. They were extremely reliable. Powered by a 180 horsepower Hispano Suiza engine, fitted with a single Vickers gun in the fuselage, firing through the propeller, synchronizer gear, and another Lewis gun mounted above the wing.
And an exact replica Albatros.
Plywood fuselage, all molded, very few metal fittings on this airplane. Easy to manufacture once you had the tooling for it. Reliable Mercedes engine, 6-cylinder inline, 180 horsepower. Dual Spandau machine guns. Pilot could look right down the guns, easy to aim. We'll do a little bit
of turning.
The team can now fly these machines in a dogfight. Only by flying them head-to-head can we see which is the finest fighter plane. Pilot Andy's challenge is to keep the British SE-5 on the tail of the German Albatros for 2 minutes. It's fast to gain speed and strong. The Albatros is camouflaged and is a close match for the SE-5's pace.
It's not a comfortable airplane like the SE-5 is. All the hot air and oil and grease and water that come off the engine goes in the pilot's face.
Despite Gene's attempts to shake Andy off, the SE-5's power easily keeps it on the tail of the German Albatros. It's 30 kilos lighter and has a sharper turning circle. Flying one against the other, there is little doubt which performs the better.
I didn't stand a chance against the SE-5. There's no way. I couldn't keep up. You could outturn me without a problem.
It's got the same speed as the Albatros, but more manoeuvrable. And it's just easier to fly, isn't it?
The British designers didn't just stop with the superlative SE-5. In June 1917, the Sopwith Camel, smaller, but heavily armed with 2 machine guns, arrived on the front. Finally, the British had 2 fighters that were better than the Albatros. The tide of the war had swung in the direction of the Allies.
There's a great advantage to having these airplanes that are accurate reproductions or truly original airplanes, because we can go back and compare some of the things that we've read about, some of the things we've all read about. And having the actual airplane and actually being able to jump from one to the other allows you to make those comparisons sort of on an even basis.
But it wasn't just down to the designers. The Allies had turned aircraft construction into a mass industry. It was a level of production that the Germans could not match. By the end of the war, more than 5,000 SE-5s had been produced, nearly double the number of any German fighter.
The British Army and the British forces, in my opinion, won the war because they could produce more than anyone else could, and their logistics were second to none. You might have an entire flight of a squadron wiped out. The next morning, there would be 6 new aircraft waiting on that airfield.
In May 1918, the Germans introduced the improved Fokker D7. But it was too little, too late, and the beginning of the end for the German army. In 4 short years, air power had arrived, and warfare would never be the same again.
When you consider that the British took something like 40 aircraft to France, 40 to 50 aircraft, at the armistice, the Royal Air Force numbered 22,600 aircraft.
By building these planes from scratch, Gene and his team have started to reveal some of the secrets that brought this extraordinary success. How history turned on a handful of humble engineers. How each small incremental change secured colossal power for the warring nations.
I think our biggest thrill is to be able to share these airplanes with the world, to showcase that the history that took place, and so that people can hear them and see them. It's truly unique.
These remarkable machines had in 4 short years transformed the battlefield. Warfare would never be the same again.
Well, slightly different. Every pub claims to be the oldest, but apart from the obvious, what treasures do our ancient British boozers hide? Rory McGrath's pub, Dig, aims to find out. The new series is next Tuesday at 8. Next tonight, it's new season CSI.